The wind was a blade, and Ara was the flesh it flayed. It did not seem to care that there was little left of her to cut. Each gust was a fresh violation, peeling away the last vestiges of warmth from her skin, leaving behind a raw, blue-tinged canvas of pure suffering. She knelt in the snow, a posture of supplication she had not chosen, forced there by the brutal grip of Jonah Barlow's youngest son. The cold was a more intimate cruelty, seeping up from the packed frozen earth through the soles of her bare feet, a paralytic numbness climbing her legs, threatening to still her heart. But her heart was already a stone in her chest, heavy and cold and dead. Jonah Barlow stood over her, a gaunt silhouette against the mercilessly bright sky. His face, pinched and weathered by a lifetime of sour resentment, was twisted in a sneer of triumph. With a final vicious tug, he ripped the last piece of her shift from her body. The thin cotton, her final shield against the world, fluttered away on the wind like a lost prayer. The laughter of his two sons, brutish echoes of their father's malice, rolled across the desolate landscape. It was a crude, ugly sound that scraped at her soul, more chilling than the wind itself. Ara's gaze was fixed on a distant point, where the bruised purple of the sky met the jagged white teeth of the mountains. She had retreated there to a place deep inside herself, where the cold and the laughter could not fully reach. She focused on the memory of warmth, of a gentle hand in hers, of a voice reading poetry by a winter fire. Thomas. Her sweet, gentle Thomas. The memory was a flickering candle in a hurricane, but she clung to it with the last of her strength. Look at it. Jonah rasped his voice, thin and sharp as a shard of ice. He held up his prize, not the tattered cloth, but the delicate silver chain that had been hidden beneath it. Dangling from the end was a small oval locket, intricately engraved with forget-me-nots. It had been Thomas's last gift to her, given on their first anniversary. Inside were two tiny, impossibly perfect portraits, one of her mother long past, and one of Thomas himself, his eyes kind, his smile hesitant. It was the only thing of value she had left. It was her entire world. Pretty little thing, Jonah mused, rubbing the silver between his thumb and forefinger. Too pretty for the likes of you. You're Barlow property now, girl. Chattel. And chattel don't get pretty things. He made to pocket it, but Ara reacted with a speed born of pure desperation. She surged upward, her hands reaching a strangled cry, tearing from her raw throat. No, please. His son shoved her back down into the snow with contemptuous ease. The impact jarred her teeth and sent a fresh wave of agony through her frozen limbs. Jonah's cruel mouth twisted. He yanked the chain. It snapped, the delicate links parting with a faint final ping. The locket was his. Her past was his. That was the moment the world changed. You're coming with me. The voice cut through the wind's howl. It was not a question. It was not an offer. It was a statement of fact, as solid and unyielding as the iron-gray mountains that clawed at the sky. Ara did not dare to look. Hope was a more dangerous thing than despair. Despair was a familiar numbness. Hope was a sharp edge that could sever you from within. The man on the dark horse seemed to materialize from the landscape itself, a figure of gray wool and worn leather. The snow, driven by the ceaseless wind, clung to him, a fine crystalline powder, coating the cracked leather of his boots, the steaming flanks of his horse, and the brim of his low-pulled hat. He dismounted in a single fluid motion, his movements economical and deliberate. There was no wasted energy in him, nothing for show. He was a man carved from the same hard substance as the land. Jonah Barlow turned his expression of smug victory curdling into one of wary irritation. This is family business. You've no business here, Silas. The man named Silas did not so much as glance at him. His gaze, a startlingly clear gray like a winter lake, was fixed on Ara. He saw not just her nakedness, but the violent tremor in her shoulders, the way her eyes stared into the abyss, the desperate attempt to transport herself anywhere but here. He saw the final shattering humiliation of the stolen locket. His gaze was not a violation, but a witnessing. He moved to the back of his saddle and untied a thick, heavy wool blanket. As he walked toward her, the space between them seemed to suck all the sound from the world. The wind died to a whisper. The chuffing of the horses, the creak of the wagon, it all faded into a roaring silence in her ears. He didn't speak again as he wrapped the heavy fabric around her. His hands were large and calloused, yet he was careful, so profoundly careful, not to let his fingers brush against her skin. The gesture was one of deep, impersonal respect that struck her with more force than a blow. He was not touching a woman. He was sheltering a creature in distress. The rough wool scratched against her skin, but the weight of it was a comfort and anchor in the dizzying vortex of her shame. Only then did he turn to face the Barlows. His expression was unchanged, as placid and formidable as a frozen river. "Get off my land." The words were spoken softly, yet they carried the absolute finality of a rock slide. Jonah's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He clutched the locket in his fist. His two sons shifted their weight, their hands hovering near the knives on their belts. But they did nothing. They saw something in Silas's stillness, in the unblinking calm of his gray eyes, that their own brand of loud, boorish cruelty could not challenge. It was like watching curs back away from a wolf, defeated not by a threat of violence, but by a will far stronger than their own. With a final venomous glare, Jonah spat a brown stream of tobacco juice onto the pristine snow. The stain was ugly, a violation. They grumbled, climbed back onto their wagon, and retreated, their angry shouts swallowed by the rising wind. Silas watched them go, his posture unwavering, until their wagon was a mere speck on the horizon. Then, and only then, he turned back to Ara. He offered a hand not to her, but to the air in front of her. An invitation. Slowly, hesitantly, she rose to her feet, clutching the blanket around her like a shield. His hand dropped. He moved to his horse, swung himself into the saddle, and then looked down at her waiting. The journey had begun. The ride to Silas's ranch was a silent procession against the vast, indifferent sky. Ara sat huddled in front of him on the saddle, the coarse wool of the blanket, a rough shield against the world. She could feel the solid wall of his chest at her back, a steady, unthreatening presence that asked for nothing. The rhythm of the horse's gait was a hypnotic metronome, each soft crunch of its hooves on the snow-covered earth a step away from the life that had been dismantled piece by piece. The jagged peaks of the valley walls seemed to lean inward, trapping them in a world of white and gray, an isolation that felt both like a sanctuary and a potential prison. He rode with a stillness that seemed to be a part of the landscape itself. His eyes constantly scanned the rolling white hills and shadowed canyons with an ingrained vigilance. He did not speak, did not offer platitudes, or ask questions she had no answers for. His silence was a refuge, a vast, quiet space where she could begin to gather the scattered, broken fragments of herself without the pressure of explanation or performance. As the first stars pricked the deepening twilight, a faint glimmer of a single lantern appeared in the distance, a tiny spark of warmth in the immense gathering dark. It was the first sign of a destination, a place she was being taken to, not a place she had chosen. Fear, cold and sharp, briefly returned. Was she trading one cage for another? His ranch was nestled in a small, protected valley, a collection of sturdy, unadorned buildings that looked as if they had grown from the earth itself. A modest house with a curl of smoke rising from its stone chimney. A solid barn and a web of fences stood against the encroaching wilderness, a testament to relentless effort and quiet endurance. He led the horse to a trough, breaking the sheet of ice on top with a single sharp blow of his fist before letting the animal drink. He slid from the saddle and then reached up for her. His hands were calloused and sure as they circled her waist, lifting her down to the ground. For a moment her legs, numb and weak, would not hold her. She swayed, and he steadied her without a word, his grip firm until she found her balance. The contact was brief, impersonal, yet it was the first human touch in a year that had not been meant to cause pain. Inside the house was sparse and clean. A great stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. The furniture was handmade, worn smooth with years of use. There was a faint scent of wood smoke, coffee, and old leather. It was a man's home, solitary and self-contained. He pointed to a closed door. "That room is yours. There are clothes on the bed. They were my mother's." He didn't wait for a reply, but moved to the stove, his actions practical, his focus already on the next necessary task. She went into the room. A simple, heavy cotton dress and a worn shift were laid out on the patchwork quilt of a narrow bed. They were clean and smelled of lye soap and sunshine, a scent from a forgotten season. She let the heavy wool blanket, the last remnant of her public shame, fall to the floor. She dressed in the borrowed clothes. They hung loosely on her frame, but they were a shield. They were a beginning. On a small, rough-hewn nightstand next to the bed sat a single object that seemed out of place. It was a leather-bound book, its cover dark and unadorned, but the quality of the binding was fine, the work of a city craftsman. It was not a Bible or a book of poetry. Curious, she opened it. The pages were filled with dense, precise handwriting and intricate drawings of geological formations, timber framing, and complex diagrams of tunnels and support structures. It was a mining engineer's journal. This book, with its intellectual precision, seemed at odds with the rugged, silent rancher she had just met. It was the first hint that Silas was more than he appeared, a man, with a history as complex and hidden as the veins of ore sketched in the journal. A quiet unease settled over her. This man was a stranger, and his past was an unknown country. For now, however, exhaustion won out over curiosity. She closed the book, placing it back exactly as she had found it. When she emerged, 2 tin plates of venison stew and dark bread sat on the simple wooden table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons on tin and the soft sigh of the fire as it consumed the logs. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was not required to be anything to anyone. She could simply be. After the meal, he took the plates to a wash basin, and she retreated to her room and the closed door a barrier she was not yet ready to cross. In the quiet darkness, listening to the wind moan around the corners of the house, Ara finally allowed herself to grieve, not just for Thomas, but for the woman she had been, a woman who had believed in the simple kindness of the world. The first few weeks passed in a slow, silent rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the land. Silas rose before dawn, the soft thud of his boots on the floorboards her only alarm clock. He would be gone for hours, tending to his few cattle, mending fences, clearing snow, existing in a state of constant, purposeful motion. He left food for her on the table without ceremony. He did not intrude on her solitude, did not knock on her door. He gave her space as if it were a physical commodity, a balm for a wound he could not see but knew was there. Ara remained within the walls of the house, a pale ghost, haunting the edges of his life. She explored the small space, her bare feet silent on the cool plank floors. The house was a reflection of the man. Everything had a purpose. There was no clutter, no sentimentality, save for a few items she found in a small wooden box on the dresser in her room. They were clearly his mother's, a set of birds whittled from pine with incredible detail. A faded photograph of a stern-looking woman with Silas's unyielding gray eyes and a single chipped porcelain teacup, its delicate handle broken off long ago. She held the fragile cup in her hands. Its uselessness was a strange comfort. It was broken like her, but it had not been thrown away. One afternoon, a month after her arrival, a fragile peace having settled over the valley, she saw it. She was staring out the small window in her room, watching the snow drift down from a leaden sky when her eyes caught movement. A dark speck on the distant eastern ridge, a place where no rider should be. It was too far to make out details, but she knew. She knew with a cold certainty that settled deep in her bones, a familiar dread that coiled in her gut. It was Jonah Barlow. The figure remained for nearly an hour, a silent, malevolent sentinel watching the ranch before finally disappearing back over the rise. A shiver unrelated to the day's chill traced a path down her spine. The valley no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a cage with a wolf circling it. Her past had followed her. She retreated from the window, while the walls of the house suddenly feeling thin and fragile. That evening, Silas came in from his chores, stomping the snow from his boots on the porch. He did not immediately start preparing dinner as he usually did. Instead, he laid a worn piece of oilcloth on the table and carefully began to disassemble his rifle. He worked under the quiet hiss of the lantern, his large hands moving with a practiced, unnerving grace. He cleaned each piece methodically, the metallic scrape and click of the components echoing in the small, warm room. He did not speak of the rider on the ridge. He did not need to. His actions were a conversation in themselves, a grim acknowledgement of the threat that now hung in the air between them. Icy fear, the kind she thought she'd left behind on that snowy patch of ground, began to creep back into Ara's heart. This quiet refuge was about to become a battleground, and she was the cause. His silence, once a comfort, now felt like the calm before a storm. She understood then that his protection was not a momentary act of charity. It was a responsibility he had shouldered, and the weight of it was about to be tested. The test came sooner than either of them expected. A week later, 2 riders approached the ranch, not from the eastern ridge, but along the main track from town. One was Jonah Barlow, his face set in a smug, confident mask. The other was a man wearing a tarnished sheriff's star on his heavy coat. He was older, with a weary slump to his shoulders and a face that had seen too much trouble to be surprised by any more of it. Silas met them on the porch, his posture relaxed, but rooted to the spot. Ara watched from the window, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silas, the sheriff, said, his voice gravelly. Jonah here has filed a complaint. Says you're holding property that belongs to him. She's not property, Sheriff, Silas replied, his voice even. Jonah sneered. She is, by law. Thomas's debts fall to his family, and she's part of the assets. We have the papers to prove it. He produced a folded document from his coat and handed it to the sheriff, who unfolded it and began to read. Ara felt the blood drain from her face. The law. They were using the law to drag her back. Her sanctuary was being dismantled not by force, but by a piece of paper. The sheriff scanned the document, his expression grim. It looks legal, Silas. It's a writ of reclamation signed by the circuit judge. It claims one Ara Miller as an indentured servant to the Barlow family to settle outstanding debts of her late husband. Silas's gaze didn't flicker. He held out his hand. Let me see it. Reluctantly, the sheriff handed it over. Silas took the paper and read it slowly, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves of the barn. Jonah's smirk widened. He had won. Then Silas spoke his voice, calm and precise. This writ was signed by Judge Miller in Rock Creek. That's right, the sheriff confirmed. Rock Creek is in the next county, Silas stated simply. This valley falls under the jurisdiction of Cutter County. Judge Miller's signature has no legal authority here. He folded the paper neatly and handed it back to the sheriff. You're enforcing a worthless document. The sheriff's face fell. He looked at the paper, then at Jonah, whose smug expression had vanished, replaced by a dark flush of fury. Now that's a technicality, Jonah began sputtering. It's the law, Silas cut in his voice, hardening for the first time. And you, sheriff, are sworn to uphold it. The law in this county. He fixed his clear gray eyes on the lawman. Or has that changed? The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. He was a man caught between his duty and his debts. He looked from Silas's unyielding face to Jonah's murderous one. Finally, he sighed a sound of profound weariness. He's right, Jonah. I can't enforce this. Not here. He turned his horse. Let's go. This isn't over? Jonah snarled at Silas, his voice raw with impotent rage. The law might be slow, but my memory is long. They rode away, leaving a cloud of simmering hatred in their wake. Silas watched them go before turning and walking back into the house, his face a mask of stone. He had won the battle, but Ara knew with chilling certainty that the war had just begun. The stakes were higher now. If they failed, the law itself would deliver her back to her tormentors. And she was beginning to suspect that Silas's fight was about more than just a stranger's safety. The failed legal attack left a poisonous residue in the air. The Barlows were not gone. They were merely regrouping. The quiet comfort of the previous weeks evaporated, replaced by a constant humming tension. Silas became more vigilant, his eyes always scanning the ridges, his rifle never far from his hand. Ara found herself listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats, starting at every snap of a twig. The sanctuary had become a prison of their own making. Driven by a restless energy and a growing need for answers, Ara began to clean the small house with a frantic intensity. It was a way to impose order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. It was during this purge that she found it. Tucked away in the back of a deep closet beneath a stack of old blankets was a small locked wooden chest. It was different from the box that held his mother's things. This one felt heavier, more secretive. Her hands trembled as she worked the simple lock with a piece of wire from the hearth. It sprang open with a soft click. Inside, nestled among more of his mother's keepsakes, a lace collar, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, was a heavy oilcloth-wrapped parcel. She unwrapped it carefully. It contained a faded photograph, its edges curled with age. Her breath caught in her throat. There were 3 men in the picture standing together against a backdrop of raw timber and dark, unforgiving rock. They were young, their faces etched with the harsh optimism of prospectors. One was a younger, grimmer version of Jonah Barlow. Another, his face softer, his smile more gentle, was her Thomas. And standing between them, his arm slung casually over Thomas's shoulder, was a young Silas, his face lean and hard, his gray eyes already holding the stillness she knew so well. They were standing in front of what looked like a mine entrance, its main support beam cracked and sagging. The world tilted on its axis. Silas knew her husband. He knew her enemies. They had not been just acquaintances. The easy camaraderie in the photograph spoke of a deeper bond, partnership, friendship. Why had he never told her? His silence, which she had mistaken for respectful distance, now seemed like a deliberate, calculated deception. Every quiet moment, every shared meal, every unspoken understanding was cast in a new, sinister light. He had rescued her from the Barlows. but he was inextricably linked to them, to the very history that had led to her ruin. A deep, cold knot of suspicion formed in her stomach. Was his protection an act of charity? Or was it a form of penance? Was he saving her from a disaster he had helped create? She stared at the photograph, at the three men bound together by a past she couldn't fathom, and realized she was more trapped than ever before. Not just by the Barlows, but by the secrets of the silent man who had offered her shelter. His motives were a mystery, and for the first time since her arrival, she felt truly afraid of him. That evening, the air in the small cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ara could not bring herself to look at Silas, her mind racing with questions she was terrified to ask. She moved about the room with a stiff, unnatural quiet, the photograph feeling like a lead weight in the pocket of her dress. Silas, preternaturally attuned to the rhythms of their shared space, felt the change. He watched her, his brow furrowed, his usual calm replaced by a watchful uncertainty. Finally, as he sat by the fire, cleaning a piece of tack, she could bear it no longer. She pulled the photograph from her pocket and walked over to him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't speak. She simply held it out to him. He looked down at the faded image in her trembling hand. His own hands, which were always so steady, stilled. The color seemed to drain from his face, leaving his features stark and grim in the firelight. He stared at the photograph for a long, silent moment, his expression unreadable, before his gaze lifted to meet hers. His eyes were filled with a profound, ancient guilt. "You knew him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew Thomas." He gave a slow, heavy nod. "You knew them all." She pressed her voice, gaining a sharp, accusatory edge. Why didn't you tell me?" He sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. He set down the leather he was working on and gestured to the chair opposite him. "Sit, Ara." She remained standing, her arms wrapped around herself. "Tell me." He looked into the fire, his face a mask of painful memory. "We were partners," he began, his voice low and rough. "Thomas, Jonah, and me. We bought a claim up in the high country, a silver mine. We thought it was going to make us rich." He spoke of the early days of the shared hope and the backbreaking labor. He described Thomas's endless optimism, Jonah's grasping ambition, and his own quiet, steady pragmatism. They were three parts of a whole bound by the dream of striking a motherlode that would change their lives forever. "There was an accident," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "A collapse in the main tunnel. The whole venture went sour after that. The support timbers gave way. We lost everything we'd put into it. It ruined us all financially." It turned Jonah bitter. He blamed Thomas for being too hopeful, for pushing us to dig deeper when we should have been more cautious. He blamed me for other things. His explanation was a dam holding back a flood. It explained the Barlows' motivation, transforming it from simple greed into a bitter, long-held grudge over a financial catastrophe. It explained the connection between the three men. But it felt incomplete. "Why did you keep it from me?" Ara asked again, her voice tight. "Did you think I was a fool that I wouldn't find out?" "No," he said finally, looking at her. The guilt in his eyes was raw, naked. "I kept it quiet to protect you. To protect you from the pain of that shared history. When I saw you out there, with them, I saw a chance to do something right. To separate you from all that ugliness. Bringing it all up again seemed like a cruelty." His words were plausible, even kind. But his tone, the way his gaze kept sliding away from hers and back to the licking flames, told her he was still holding something back. He had revealed a partial truth a carefully edited version of the story designed to satisfy her questions without revealing the core of his shame. The mystery of his past had deepened, and her unease solidified into a cold, hard certainty. The worst part of the story was yet to be told. The man who had saved her life was a stranger once more, and the trust she had begun to build lay in ruins at her feet. The partial truth hung between them for days, a shroud of unspoken words and lingering distrust. Winter, which had held back for a period of false spring, returned with a vengeance. The sky turned a dark, bruised gray, and a blizzard descended upon the valley. It was not a gentle snowfall, but a furious, howling assault. The wind shrieked like a banshee, driving snow so thick it was impossible to see more than a few feet beyond the cabin walls. The world shrank to the small, fragile sanctuary of the house and barn, and the deep, suffocating white that surrounded them. They were trapped. On the second day of the storm, as Silas was securing a loose shutter, he saw them. 3 dark figures barely visible through the swirling snow, moving slowly but deliberately toward the ranch. The Barlows. They were using the blizzard as cover for their final assault. They were not coming with legal papers this time. They were coming to burn the ranch to the ground, to erase Silas from the land, and reclaim Ara by force. This was no longer about debt or the law. It was about annihilation. "They're here," he said, his voice flat as he stepped back inside, snow melting from his hat and shoulders. The words, though expected, landed like a physical blow. Ara's breath hitched. The environmental threat of the storm and the physical threat of the Barlows merged into a single, overwhelming wave of terror. The howling wind outside was no longer just weather. It was the soundtrack to their final stand. Personal distrust was a luxury they could no longer afford. Survival became the only thing that mattered. Without another word, they began to work together, a grim, silent team. He barred the main door with a heavy beam of oak, while she secured the windows, pushing heavy furniture against them. He loaded his rifle and a shotgun, laying out extra cartridges on the table with methodical calm. She filled every bucket and pot with water from the pump, not just for drinking, but to fight the fires she knew they would set. Their movements were efficient, synchronized by the urgent rhythm of impending violence. They were no longer a protector and a victim, or 2 strangers bound by a secret past. They were 2 people fighting for their lives, their personal conflict forced into the background by the immediate life-threatening danger. The claustrophobic atmosphere created by the storm intensified with every passing moment. The fight was no longer just for Ara's freedom, but for their very survival against both man and nature. As darkness fell and the storm raged on, they took up positions by separate windows, waiting for the inevitable. The silence in the cabin was a taut wire, vibrating with fear and the terrible unspoken truths that lay between them. The attack began with fire. A flaming bundle of oil-soaked rags landed on the porch roof, and the orange glow, a sickening contrast to the white of the storm. Silas was out the back door in an instant, using one of the buckets of water to douse the flames before they could take hold. It was a diversion. While he was occupied, the main assault came at the barn. The heavy thud of an axe against the reinforced door echoed through the blizzard's roar. "Stay here," Silas commanded as he burst back into the cabin, grabbing his shotgun. "Don't open the door for anyone." But Ara could not stay. She was no longer the helpless woman who had knelt in the snow. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth, its weight a solid, reassuring presence in her hand, and followed him. The climax unfolded in the dimly lit, snow-swept barn. The wind howled through the slats, creating a symphony of ghostly moans. The Barlows had breached the side door. Luke, the younger son, lay still near the entrance, felled by the first blast from Silas's shotgun. The other son, Mark, was exchanging fire with Silas from behind a stack of hay bales. It was Jonah who was the true threat. He had circled around and now stood on the upper level of the hayloft, a pistol in his hand, a clear shot down at Silas. "Drop it." Silas Jonah's voice was a triumphant snarl. "Or I'll put a bullet in your back." Silas froze his rifle half raised. He was caught. Mark emerged from behind the hay, a cruel grin on his face. Ara watched from the shadows near the entrance, her heart a frantic trapped bird. She had to do something. "It was never about the money, was it?" Jonah Silas said, his voice strangely calm as he slowly lowered his rifle. Jonah laughed a harsh, broken sound. "Money. You think this is about money. This is about justice. This is about my son." He gestured wildly with his pistol. "That was my boy Silas. My only son Daniel, the third man in that picture you keep hidden away." The story's most important plot twist exploded in the chaotic confines of the barn. The mine collapse wasn't just an accident. Jonah screamed, his face contorted with 2 decades of grief and rage. It was him, your friend, the weakling Thomas. He was so desperate to find a rich vein, so desperate to prove he wasn't a failure, that he used shoddy timber for the supports. Green pine, when he knew it, should have been seasoned oak. You warned him, I warned him, but he wouldn't listen. Ara felt the world crumble beneath her feet. Thomas, her kind, gentle Thomas, had done this. Daniel was in that tunnel when it came down. Jonah's voice cracked. Buried alive because of your partner's weakness. And you walked away. You knew what he was doing. You argued with him, and then you just quit the partnership a week before it happened. You washed your hands of it and left my boy to die. Jonah's vendetta wasn't about money or land. It was revenge for his child. He blamed Thomas for his weakness and Silas for his silence, for walking away and leaving them to their fate. He raised his pistol, aiming it squarely at the unarmed Silas. Now you pay your part of the debt. In that heart-stopping moment, as Jonah's finger tightened on the trigger, a secondary twist occurred. Ara moved. Her mind, sharpened by months of quiet observation, remembered something. In the back of the barn was a pulley system for lifting hay bales to the loft, the main rope tied off on a cleat right below where Jonah stood. She had watched Silas use it a dozen times. With the iron poker clutched in her hands, she ran. Not at Jonah, but at the rope. With a desperate, powerful swing, she struck the cleat, splintering the wood. The rope snapped free. The heavy block and tackle, weighing hundreds of pounds, plummeted from the rafters. It didn't hit Jonah, but it crashed into the loft floor right beside him with the force of a thunderclap. The old floorboards exploded, and Jonah, screaming in shock and terror, was thrown off balance, tumbling from the loft to the hard-packed earth below. His pistol flew from his grasp. The diversion was all Silas needed. He launched himself at Mark, disarming him with a brutal efficiency that sent the man crashing into a stall. The fight was over. Jonah lay groaning on the ground, his leg broken. Mark was unconscious. Luke was gone. In the sudden ringing silence, broken only by the howl of the wind, Silas looked at Ara. She stood panting, the heavy poker still in her hand, her eyes wide with the shock of what she had done and what she had heard. During the chaos, as Jonah fell, she had seen something glint on the dirt floor. Her locket, snatched from Jonah's pocket by the fall. She had moved without thinking, scooping it up, its cold metal a familiar weight in her palm. Now she clutched it tight, a link to a past that was now infinitely more complex and tragic than she had ever imagined. The Barlows were defeated, but the emotional wreckage of Jonah's revelation hung heavy and suffocating in the air. In the quiet aftermath, the blizzard began to subside. The wind's mournful howl softened to a whisper, and the world outside the cabin windows slowly reappeared, draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white. The violence was over, but the battle had just begun. Silas had bound Jonah and his remaining son, leaving them in the cold confines of the barn to await the sheriff, who he would fetch when the path was clear. Back in the house, surrounded by the evidence of their fight, the overturned furniture, the scattered cartridges, the lingering scent of gunpowder, they finally had to face the full truth. Aura sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot coffee she could not drink. In one hand, she clutched the silver locket, its surface now dented and scratched. She placed it on the table between them. It was a question, an accusation, and a plea all at once. Silas sat opposite her, his face etched with an exhaustion that went far beyond the physical struggle. He looked at the locket, then at her, and the walls he had so carefully constructed around his past finally crumbled. He was telling the truth. Silas said, his voice raw. All of it. He told her everything. He explained his guilt, and it was far deeper than she had imagined. He hadn't just walked away from the partnership. He had known with absolute certainty that Thomas was cutting corners using dangerously substandard timber to shore up the main tunnel. He had confronted Thomas, arguing with him, pleading with him to stop before he got someone killed. But Thomas, desperate and full of a pride born of weakness, refused to listen. I left Silas confessed, his gaze fixed on the scarred wooden tabletop. I told him I wouldn't be a party to it. I sold him my share for a pittance and walked away. I did it to clear my own conscience. But I never went to Jonah. I never told his boy Daniel how bad it really was. I just left. My silence killed him as surely as Thomas's cheap timber did. He finally looked up, and the weight of 2 decades of guilt was there in his clear gray eyes. When I saw what Jonah was doing to you, it felt like a reckoning, like the past had come back for me, rescuing you, protecting you. It was my attempt at atonement, a way to right a wrong that had festered inside me for half my life. It was selfish. It was my penance, and I dragged you into it. His raw, honest confession was the key that unlocked everything. She finally understood the depth of his silence, the reason for his solitary existence, the fierce protective force he had aimed at her. He was a man living in a prison of his own making. Ara, in turn, had to reconcile the image of her kind, gentle husband with the knowledge of his fatal weakness, a weakness that had cost a young man his life, and set in motion all the tragedy that followed. The man she had loved was not a monster, but a flawed human being whose desperation had led to disaster. There was a quiet, aching grief in that understanding. She reached across the table and pushed the locket toward him. It wasn't just your burden to carry, Silas. In that moment, the last of the secrets dissolved. There was no more suspicion, no more distrust. There was only a shared, painful truth, and the quiet, fragile beginnings of a forgiveness that they would have to extend not only to each other, but to themselves. A year later, spring had returned to the valley. The scars on the land and on their lives were healing. The barn had been repaired, its new timbers a testament to a future built correctly without cutting corners. The ranch was quiet life, having found a new peaceful rhythm. The resolution was not about forgetting the past, but about accepting it, about understanding that the cracks and fissures were now part of the whole. One clear morning, Ara walked to a quiet spot on a bluff overlooking the valley. The air was sweet with the scent of pine and thawing earth. In her hands, she held 2 objects, the silver locket and the mended porcelain teacup. She looked at the locket one last time, at the smiling face of the husband she had loved, and whispered a quiet goodbye. A goodbye not to the man, but to the grief and the life she had lost. With a final gentle gesture, She dug a small hole in the soft earth and buried the locket, returning the past to the land. She returned to the house and placed the teacup on the small table where she and Silas now shared all their meals. It was no longer empty. She had filled it with the tiny, vibrant purple wildflowers that grew near the creek. It was a symbol of their future two broken people who had painstakingly pieced themselves and each other back together, creating something new and beautiful, not in spite of its flaws, but because of them. Silas came in from the morning chores and saw the cup. He walked to the table and stood beside her, looking at the delicate flowers held within the web of mended porcelain. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, his hand came to rest gently over hers where it lay on the table. It was a simple touch, warm and solid, a quiet promise of a shared future. Built not on silence and guilt, but on shared understanding and healing. Together, they looked out the window at the valley, their hard-won sanctuary bathed in the clean, hopeful light of a new day.